My fiancé and I took one of our bucket list vacations last winter near the Canadian border so that we could visit Niagara Falls. We were staying in a small log cabin, part of a campground, and planned on skiing and screwing around for the weekend. Unfortunately, that isn't exactly how things worked out. Initially, everything was great. We got there early, moved in, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, me and my wife were having an excellent time. That is, until nightfall. We were outside grilling, figuring out how to keep a fire lit. Neither of us are exactly camping experts, when we began to notice something awry. At first, all we could focus on was the smell, the horrendous, inhuman stench of pure rot. It was foul, worse than a skunk, worse than finding a dead mouse in your basement, just putrid. It seemed like it was far enough away at that point, just sort of wafting, but that definitely doesn't mean it was unnoticeable. Immediately, I wanted to go inside. I'm somewhat of a scaredy cat myself, and frankly, I had no interest in finding out more. My fiancé, on the other hand, is much braver than I, annoyingly so, a paramedic no less, and wanted to see what was the matter. They insisted that it might be a herd animal, or if not, just something interesting to look at. Luckily, at this point, I talked them into waiting until the morning to investigate anything. After we finally managed to get the fire lit and have a few roasted marshmallows, we talked about heading in for the evening. Moments later, just as we put out the fire, we began to hear the oddest, most artificial cry for help. "Help me, please." I don't know how to describe it really, but I'll never forget how the voice made me feel. Unsettled. Awe. It was unnatural, like it was clear someone or something was mimicking the yell. Now, I've seen far too many horror films to go wandering into the forest looking for a mysterious wounded person. But my fiancé wanted to see what was going on, and I wasn't going to let them go alone. We agreed to only walk as far as we could, while still seeing the cabin, still being lit up by the general property. I was not going anywhere too dark. So there we went, towards the direction of the ominous yelling, and evidently the same direction as the foul odor that seemed to grow more and more repulsive by the minute. This just convinced my fiancé that whoever it was, yelling for help like that, was injured in some gruesome way. Also, I don't want to sound like some uppity homebody who just isn't used to the smells of the great outdoors. I've been camping in my life more times than I could count, not to mention hunting and fishing, and I can promise you this smell wasn't the smell of any dead animal I've ever seen. My nostrils practically burned in reaction to that rot, and the closer we approached, the more eager I was to get the hell back into our cabin. But onward we went, and as the sound grew closer, the more distorted it became. I wouldn't have been surprised at that point if it was a recording or something. But that's just the thing. Once we got close enough to make out the shadow of a figure, the stature of the silhouette was terrifyingly large in comparison to the voice it was simulating. It was tall, too tall to be a person, or frankly, anything else I've ever seen. I have to admit, we didn't get a good look at the thing. When we made out the shape of it from about 15 feet back, something like that, I grabbed my fiancé and absolutely booked it. Now, I could be wrong. In fact, really, I hope that I am. Because by the looks of it, that thing, whatever it was about 8 feet tall with antlers. Unless a giant elk figured out how to stand on its hind legs, I really doubt that what we saw was any kind of animal. Naturally, we decided it was best to cut the trip short. We figured that instead of staying the week, we'd only stay for the rest of the weekend, then find a hotel somewhere. Now, here's the oddest part. The very next day, we go down to the main office building of the campground, just to tell them about what we saw and everything. The guy looked uninterested as hell until I said the word antlers. After that, as I talked about the nasty-ass smell, you could see the guy get practically as white as a sheet. It definitely didn't help calm my nerves, because as soon as we were done talking, the guy offered us half of our deposit back. I've never heard of someone getting offered money for spotting an animal on the property of a campground. I'll admit the following night, our last night, was in a lot of ways normal. Except, of course, for us being scared half to death that we were going to have our door smashed in by some weird creature. The moral of the story is, we're never heading back to that campground in that part of the country. Who knows what could have happened if we actually approached this thing? Just be careful when you're up in the east, and watch out for that stench. Nothing good will come of it, I can tell you that. I ended up losing my job because our business had to close, and I didn't have much savings built up. I was living in upstate New York at the time and had really been enjoying my independence. But then it was like everything changed almost overnight. My uncle flipped houses professionally and had purchased some cheap property in an old suburb up there. He was willing to let me move in for free while it was being worked on. It was pretty run down, but it had an extra bedroom that wasn't in the worst shape. And it had heating and running water, so I moved in and lived on the ground floor with my 2 cats. Things went along pretty okay for a couple of months. I don't exactly know why, but one day these 2 stray cats started hanging around my porch. I don't know if my cats attracted them or what. I did not encourage them at all. I never left food outside, and I kept trying to shoo them away. But they both would just look me in the eye and ignore my shooing and act like they belonged there. I guess I'm weak when it comes to cats, though, because I'll admit it wasn't long before I had 4 cats living inside with me. However, right after they moved in, things started feeling kind of weird in the house. I started hearing strange noises at night, and things would go missing, like pieces of my jewelry. Like I would take off my rings and earrings at night, but then one piece wouldn't be there in the morning. But then that piece would reappear later in the day, making me think I was going crazy. I admit I'm kind of an absent-minded person, so it's not that unusual for me to move stuff and then forget about where I put it. But it really felt like a lot of things. And then after a month or so, the cats started acting peculiar. They would gather and hiss at the door to the basement. All 4 of them. One time in the middle of the night, they started yowling so loud it woke me up. I went down to check on things, but they all just scattered. So, figuring I would get to the bottom of it, I opened the basement door and headed down to check it out. I got to the bottom of the stairs, but it just looked like a normal, creepy basement to me. And then it got worse. The cats started doing this every night. They would gather and start hissing and yowling at the basement door. I started thinking maybe there were rats in the basement or something. I told my uncle about it, and he called in an exterminator to lay down poison and traps. When the exterminator finished, he made a comment about how it was important to keep the cats out of the basement. When he said that, it occurred to me that not once had any of the 4 cats ever crossed the basement threshold, even though the door was open on a fairly regular basis. One day, I was in the kitchen doing the dishes, and my uncle was upstairs working on house repairs. Then I heard him walk across the creaky floor up there, and then I heard him break into a full run down the stairs to the first floor and toward the basement door. I assumed he went into the basement because I heard the door slam with so much force that it scared me, and I almost dropped the dish I was washing. I then walked over towards the basement door to see what had happened, and opened the basement door to yell at him for being such a bozo and scaring the hell out of me. That's when I heard a noise behind me and spun around to see my uncle coming down from upstairs to ask what all the commotion was about. Oh my God, was it not him that had gone down in the basement? We were the only 2 people in the house. When I realized that he had been upstairs the whole time, my blood ran ice cold. I told him that someone had run down the stairs and had slammed the door shut. He went down there to look and didn't find anything down there. So now I was feeling super uncomfortable about living there. I mean, the cat sounds at night were getting nuts, and I was so sleep-deprived I honestly started hallucinating. I went down there one night to shush them up, and I imagined I saw this old woman standing in front of the basement door, wagging her finger at them. Then they really started yowling. Everything was making me crazy. All the changes that the pandemic had caused, my stress over losing my job, my weird living arrangement, I was really over it. A week or 2 later, I made the hard decision to move back home with my parents in Connecticut. My uncle decided to sell the property to some developers. None of the repairs were going right. When he was selling it, he came across some information about an old woman who had lived there alone with her cats for years. She was found dead in the basement one day. It seems she died when she fell down the stairs. There was a creepy rumor that when the cats found her, they might have chewed on some of her body parts. I can't even talk about it. That totally grosses me out. It makes me wonder if the 2 stray cats were associated with her. I couldn't take all 4 cats to my parents, but fortunately we found someone willing to adopt them. I always get chills when I think about that story. I never paid much attention to that kind of stuff either. But now I don't know what to believe. Let me tell you, once you experience something unexplainable firsthand, it's no longer fun. It's a memory that tears you apart from the inside out, and no matter how much you plead with people to believe you, even you can't convince yourself you sound anything other than crazy. I was 18 years old the first time my parents went out of town and left me home alone for the entire weekend. While to most kids my age this would have sounded like pure bliss, I was terrified. Pleaded for them to cancel their trip even. You see, I grew up in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, and while beautiful during the daytime, I always found myself extremely paranoid at night. There were trees everywhere, and no way of knowing what was lurking behind them in the shadows. Not to mention, the trees towered so high above that oftentimes they shaded out any hint of moonlight, making it exceptionally difficult to see anything outside at night. Of course, this did not stop things on the outside from looking into my home. And though I never particularly caught anything peering through my windows, the hair on the back of my neck was always standing up as though something were. Oh, and did I mention, the vast majority of the first story of my house was made up of sliding glass doors? Go figure. The only thing that kept me semi-sane while downstairs at night was my dog Rango. He was a particularly good guard dog and would cause a scene anytime he sensed something near the house. This is why that Saturday evening when my parents were gone and Rango started having a complete fit at the back door, I knew something was wrong. I tried to talk myself down at first. Chances are the thing setting Rango off could have been a deer, squirrel, or maybe even a raccoon digging in his food dish on the porch. These were way more logical and preferable to whatever the hell was actually out there that night. Being as adult as I possibly could, I told Rango to hush and even went as far as putting him in my parents' bedroom for a few minutes to get him to settle down. With Rango in the room and tamed from barking, an eerie silence fell over the house, and that's when I first heard it. This strange, sporadic clicking sound. It didn't seem to come at routine intervals. It was random, ranging in pitch and length. Almost how you hear raptors click to communicate with each other in old Jurassic Park films. I spent the next 5 minutes scouring the house, searching for the source of the clicking noise. But the more I searched, the less hope I had for finding it, and the more anxious I became. The last room I had to check off of my search was the kitchen, and when I heard the clicking coming from beyond the sink, outside of the window peering into my backyard, I could hardly breathe. My terror overtook me, and I sprinted to let Rango out of the room. That's when I saw it. It came sprinting into view, as if having followed me on the outside of the house, from the kitchen window to the back porch. The motion sensor lights lit up, and I cannot make up what I saw even if I wanted to. A pale white humanoid figure hunched over on all fours, moving faster than any person should be capable of in that position. It had a large, round face with gaping black eyes, but no nose that I could see. Its mouth hung open in the most sinister way, and it continued making those same deafening clicking noises, but now even louder than before. I let out the most blood-curdling scream and flung open the door to my parents' bedroom. Rango sprung into action, charging the glass slider and barking more aggressively than he ever has before. The hair on his body was raised, his paws slammed into the glass, and if there were no barrier between the two, I'm confident Rango would have ripped that thing to shreds. The creature seemed startled by Rango's appearance and jolted back and forth across the porch as if to evade his advancements. I'm not sure how I worked up the courage to do what I did next, but it was as though my mind weren't in control of my body. I sprinted towards the glass and grabbed Rango's collar, bringing me face to face with the creature. It threw itself at the glass in an attempt to pounce, at which point I was almost certain I'd have a fatal heart attack. I flailed backwards, Rango following closely behind, and could only manage to make my legs work for 15 seconds more as I threw myself up the stairs and into my room. I slammed the door and locked it, but even that wasn't providing the security it needed to. I had a window in my room and could not bear to be anywhere near it. So naturally, I huddled Rango and I inside my small closet and did not hesitate to dial 911. To cut to the chase, all but one of the police officers who'd heard a story of a similar creature did not believe me about the encounter, and as the story goes, there was absolutely no evidence, not even a footprint in the wet dirt to support my case. But honestly, their belief wasn't what I needed. All I needed was to never be alone in that house again, which I accomplished when I had the sudden urge to go to college far away in the city. I typically refrain from bringing up the story nowadays, mainly because I don't indulge in reliving the experience. But no matter how far away I am from that dreaded creature, it still seems to find a way to haunt me, even if now only in my dreams. My best friend lives 5 minutes away from me. It's super easy to get to their house, just 2 back roads and a left turn. But I'll admit, the second of the 2 roads is lined with trees and can be a little creepy to drive at night. Regardless of this, I always drove the back roads. Driving the opposite direction took significantly longer. At this age, I really have no excuse to avoid a road solely because it's in the woods and feels creepy. Well, that was until last night. It's hard to put the encounter into words without sounding crazy, even though I've always found cryptids fascinating. I thought creatures like this were just for fun, stories to tell around a bonfire. And not only that, but I live in Delaware. I mean, nothing out of the ordinary ever happens here. I'm making a left onto this back road and remember thinking it was eerily dark. I look up at the sky and it must have been a new moon or something because it was bare. Not even a star to look at. Not to mention the most putrid smell was in the air. I thought for sure someone must have hit a skunk or the old creek had overflowed. After a couple seconds of driving, I flash on my high beams because I can hardly see, and that's when I saw it. I slammed my brakes, my breath caught in my throat. It was like for a minute everything stopped. It must have been every bit of 8 feet tall, reared up on its back legs in the middle of the road. I guess in situations like that, your brain does everything possible to explain away what you're seeing. And as much as I would have been relieved to say this thing was a malnourished horse, it simply wasn't. While its face did look like a horse, it had these horns protruding out of its head, wrapping backwards almost like you'd expect to see on a goat. And while I can't be certain, it looked as though its skin was scaly, not furry, because of the way it clung to the bones underneath. Despite how skeletal this thing was, my brain is still racing, seeking any explanation possible as to what it is. That's when its wings jut out. They were bony, tattered, and ripped up in several places. I obviously knew there was no way a bat could be this big, but perhaps the scientists were wrong, and pterodactyls weren't extinct. Like I said, my mind was trying to explain this away any way it possibly could. I wasn't sure the thing would be able to fly with how beat up it looked, but I was not sticking around to find out. It felt like an eternity had passed since turning down this road, but I know in actuality it must have been only 10 seconds max. Yet it was as though my body had forgotten how to work a car. I could not for the life of me figure out how to shift into reverse. As the danger I'm in starts to settle over me, I panic. My palms are sweaty, I'm breathing heavy and desperately trying to get the car out of drive. I likely fumbled around for only 5 seconds, but in this situation, that was far too long. I look up, and the creature slowly rotates its body to face my car, and its piercing yellow eyes seem to lock with mine. Screw the reverse. I knew if I wanted to live, the time was now or never. I slammed my foot on the gas and thanked God every day that there was a small clearance onto the right side of the road before the trees began. My car lurched off the cement onto the grass, and I completed the fastest U-turn imaginable. When I'm finally facing the opposite direction, I launch my car back up onto the road. I'm thinking to myself, if I stay in the dirt, my tires may spin, and that's time I cannot afford to waste. Since having turned the car, the road in my rear view fell pitch black once again, besides two glowing dots. I knew it was the creature's eyes, still looking in my direction. And what's worse, they started moving. To say I'm lucky that nothing or nobody was in front of me while driving is an understatement. I wouldn't have seen them if there was, because my eyes were glued to the rearview mirror. At first, the eyes seemed to bounce up and down, a movement that told me this thing must have been galloping towards me. Despite my anguish in realizing this, my foot did not waver. A quick glance at the speedometer told me I was already running at 95 miles per hour and had no intentions of easing up. Suddenly, the eyes stopped moving up and down and instead shot straight into the air, out of sight in my rear view. The pit in my stomach became astronomically bigger as it dawned on me that this thing was now in the air. As much as I was terrified to exit the safety of my car, I knew at that point the most logical decision was to get home and back in my house. At the very least, my parents would be there, and I wouldn't be facing this thing alone. As you can imagine, I got home in record speed and didn't even pause to think when I threw my car in park and ran inside without even turning it off. It's been 4 months since the encounter with that creature, and I see a virtual therapist 3 times a week to manage my fear of leaving the house. I'm doing my best to implement the best practices I'm given, but one thing is for certain. Even when I work up the courage to drive on my own, I know I will never be driving that back road again. No one ever wants to be the person that saw something unbelievable. I live in southern Georgia. I won't tell you my exact location because I don't want anyone to pinpoint who I am. Plus, it could be dangerous here. No one needs to come around here trying to track things down. I own a decent little cabin on the outskirts of town. The main reason I bought it is because of the wrap around porch. The backside of my cabin overlooks a creek. My entire property spans 12 wooded acres, so it is my own private getaway. I work a high-paced job at my local ER, so having the view that I have gives me some nice quiet time. I see deer often. I've also seen a wildcat and even a few bears. Mostly deer, though. I leave out corn near the creek for the deer. If you didn't know, deer love corn, especially if it's still on the cob. I get to sit out back and watch the wildlife and listen to the creek. It helps me relax after 24+ hours at the hospital. I noticed about 3 weeks ago that the corn I was leaving out was not being touched. This did happen a while back when we had a big old black bear roaming the area. He didn't stay long and the deer came back to munch on corn in just a few days. Anyways, this morning I came home as usual. When I pulled up my driveway, I could see that my trash can had been dumped over and there was trash everywhere. Sometimes raccoons or even a bear will get into the trash, but they've never made that bad of a mess. This was crazy. Containers and bottles were opened, and it seemed like things had been separated into gross trash piles. I grabbed a few trash bags and some gloves so I could pick it all up. It was pretty annoying, but it was my fault for forgetting to put the lock on it the last time I brought my trash out. So I go inside and take a shower, then decide to make myself some breakfast. Nothing crazy, avocado toast and some scrambled eggs with a glass of fresh orange juice on the side. It was still pretty cool out, so I decided to go sit on the back porch, just relax, maybe check on my deer. I sat down at my little patio table, just like I have a million other times. Ready to eat and thinking about doing some yoga after my food settles, I smelled something terrible. It was a rancid mix of hot, unwashed armpits and dirty, wet dog. I gagged, it was so bad. Then I heard the growling. It was coming from the corner of my porch. There was a huge man. Gigantic, honestly. He was at least 10 feet tall. He was covered in black, coarse hair, but not on his face. I could see his beady black eyes clear as day. He was angry and had his huge, ape-like hands balled up into a fist. He let out a loud roar from his mouth, which really didn't look much different than any human's mouth, but his teeth were very large and yellow. I could smell his breath from where I was standing. My brain was just trying to process what I was looking at, and for some reason I was not scared. I just knew I had two options: fight or flight. I just looked at him and then motioned to my plate. I started backing away slowly. I knew I had my cell phone in my pocket so I could use the automated entry to get through my front door. He roared again, but luckily he did not move towards me. I felt like he could probably move fast, just based on how large his feet were. They were humongous, just like him. I just said to him, "You can have that food. I'm not really all that hungry." Don't ask me why I said that. I know how insane it sounds hours later. Me telling a strange creature on my back porch that I'm not hungry. I backed around the corner and moved quickly to my front door. I did not hear him follow me, which I am still thankful for. I unlocked the front door and went inside. I locked and bolted the front door. I stopped at the hall closet and grabbed my can of bear mace. Luckily, I bought it back when I was worried about that big black bear. I went straight to my back door and bolted it too. Even now, I am not sure that it would keep him out if he tried to come in through either door. So far, it seems to be working. I did peek out my kitchen window and my food was gone along with the plate. My utensils and juice glass were scattered on the porch in front of my table, which I am assuming he knocked over. I didn't see him anywhere. Thinking about it now, I think that man or creature or thing went through my trash. I do really also think that if he wanted to hurt me, he could have. He didn't try to get in the house, he just ate food and left. I've just been sitting here trying to wrap my mind around the situation, to be honest. Something wild happened to me in the summer of 2002. I've told this story only a handful of times since then, and nearly every time I've told it, I've been disbelieved. I was 19 years old and decided that summer to head to Chicago on my own. I'm from a small town in rural Ohio and had never been on a big solo adventure, so even though it's really just a few hours drive away, I thought it would be a good way to dip my toes into big city life and make for a fun adventure to tell my friends about when I got back. The only problem was that, at that time in my life, I hated being alone. I craved the company of other people, and the drive out was feeling pretty lonely after the first hour or so, and that's when I decided to pull off at a rest stop just to not be alone. While walking in, this guy came walking up to me quickly and looked me right in the eyes and basically begged me to give him a ride. Yes, I know it was a risky and dangerous thing to do, but I told the guy I could take him as far as Chicago. I did tell him I had one condition for him riding with me, though. He had to empty his pockets and put everything he had in the trunk. I'd heard horror stories about hitchhikers being serial killers, and I wasn't going to risk him having a gun or a knife to stick to my throat once we were down the road away. He agreed to my terms and hopped in for the ride. At first, he seemed really cool and down to earth. He told me about his upbringing in Northern California, growing up with a twin sister, and how he'd once worked in law enforcement. He was very vague about his role in law enforcement, but I chalked it up to him maybe having to leave the job for reasons he wasn't proud of. But this is where it took a turn for the weird. The guy told me that he was former CIA and that he had wound up learning of a massive government conspiracy and cover-up regarding the Roswell, New Mexico discoveries. He said that we had essentially poisoned these visitors from outer space, declaring war on another planet, and that we are all just sitting ducks now, just waiting for them to finish assessing their options and deal a blow black. He went on to tell me about how he was going to uncover this information years ago and blow the top off the whole thing, and that's when the CIA sent someone to kill him and dispose of the evidence, but he'd managed to outsmart them, and that's why he was out in the world homeless, hitchhiking from city to city to keep from being found out. At this point, I was regretting my decision to invite him along, because I was thinking he was a crazy and maybe dangerous person to be around. I decided to change the subject to something a little less intense, and hopefully get him to calm down a bit so I could work out an excuse to drop him early at the next town. I asked him simply what his star sign was and told him I'm a Leo. He looked at me like I'd just grown an extra head and started demanding I let him out of the car right away. I kept asking him to calm down, but every time I'd try to calm him, he'd panic and yell back at me, "You're one of them! You're one of them!" Finally, I was able to pull off an exit, and he opened the door, jumped out, and ran straight back into a field. I was so flustered by the whole thing that I sped off without even thinking about the fact that I had all his stuff still back in my trunk. That thought didn't occur to me until I was already in Chicago. I felt terrible and didn't know what to do about any of it, but my mother had always told me that if you find something that isn't yours, you should turn it in somewhere where it can be found, and I figured the police were the best bet in this situation. I stopped at the first police precinct I could find and took the stuff inside. I told them I'd given a hitchhiker a ride, but he seemed a little crazy and he took off, and I forgot all about his stuff in my car until then. They had a good laugh and asked me if I'd learned my lesson about offering strangers rides. One officer even kind of half scolded me for taking such a dumb risk. I assured them that I would never pick up another one, and I've been true to my word on that ever since. But that isn't where the story ends. A few weeks later, I was sitting at home in Ohio playing video games in my tiny apartment when there was a loud knock at the door. When I answered, I was surprised to find two men in black suits asking to come inside and speak to me. They had a lot of questions about the hitchhiker and what he might have said to me before he took off running. I remembered what he said about the CIA trying to kill him for knowing too much, and these guys certainly seemed to be agents of some kind, so I bluffed my way through it, pretending he had been so crazy I didn't understand a word of anything he said. It's been 20 years now, and sometimes I still see black vehicles with dark-tinted windows driving slowly by my house. It's super freaky. I'm totally convinced that I, too, am now having tabs kept on me, and I honestly wonder if it's only a matter of time before I've have my thumb in the air on a highway, trying to stay one step ahead. I live just outside of Port Gibson, Mississippi, and have always loved the lay of the land out here. There's a lot of history, and, in the Port Gibson area, a lot of little waterways scattered here and there. I moved to Port Gibson about 3 years ago with my friend Craig. We both took jobs at a factory out here and were sharing the second floor of a 3-story house. About 2 years ago, Craig and I were working third shift. For anyone who doesn't know, that's basically overnight. We went in at 10 at night and were scheduled until 6 in the morning, but could leave earlier if our work got done and there was an overlap in shifts. On this night in August, there was, so we dipped out around 4:30 in the morning. Craig didn't have a car, so we always took my Pontiac to the factory. The house we lived in was in a rural area of Port Gibson, and we had to drive almost half an hour to the factory along a long road that wasn't exactly a highway, but close. It's considered a main road out here and runs from Port Gibson west toward the Mississippi River. In one area, it gets close to Bayou, a muddy river that has a lot of creeks running off it. Craig and I were heading home, and because it was so early in the morning, it was still dark out. We had about a half hour until dawn, and I was driving with the headlights on. I've toned it down in the last few years, but back then, we used to rip around pretty good, and that's what we were doing on this road when it curved closer to the bayou and a creek that passed under the road. As we came around the corner, I saw something in the road and laid on the brakes hard. My first thought was that someone had hit an alligator, which isn't super common but happens now and then, especially at night when they try to cross the roads. I slowed down and squinted as we were coming up on it, but the shape looked wrong, and Craig said out loud that it had to be a body. Unfortunately, bodies have been found in and around Bayou throughout the years, so that wasn't unlikely either. I got goosebumps thinking that we were about to see a dead body someone had dumped and wanted to hit the gas again, but the road was narrow here, and I didn't want to risk thumping over whatever it was. "Slow down a little bit," Craig said, leaning over the driver's side to see out my window better. The thing was on my side of the road and not moving. I told him, "I think there's something wrong," because my brain couldn't make what I was looking at make any sense. Now that we were closer, it definitely looked like an alligator, but also like a human. In fact, I could see two legs twisted at odd angles out behind it, with bare feet limp on the asphalt. But the top half of the body didn't make sense. The head wasn't a human head. It wasn't as large as an alligator's, but shared the same shape with an elongated kind of muzzle. Craig swore and pulled back, asking if I saw the scales. I nodded and couldn't speak. We were up next to the thing now, and my window was up, but I was still scared to lean close and get a better look. I did anyway and saw what looked like a messed-up science experiment. The bottom half of the body was human with rough-looking skin, dark in an odd way. At around where the hips started, we could see scales overlapping up the torso and trunk. The creature was lying on its stomach with the arms splayed out oddly, and again, I thought someone had probably hit it. The face was facing away from us, but we could see the hairless head, ridges along the temple and upper cheek, and then the protrusion of the snout. We pulled past the thing, and I kept looking in the rearview mirror, but it was so dark all we could see was the shape of it. "Do you think it came out of the river?" Craig asked. I didn't see where else it could have come from. That section of the road is in the middle of nowhere with no houses nearby, and it definitely looked like whatever that thing was had dragged itself out of the creek. Plus, it was naked. My knuckles were white as we drove back to the apartment, talking and trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Craig brought up the head and upper body first. I agreed that it looked reptilian, but too small to be an alligator. He then asked if I thought someone had done something messed up, like sew a human and an alligator together. I admitted that I'd considered that, but then pointed out that the skin on the lower body didn't really look like regular human skin. We got back to the apartment and hurried inside, both of us weirded out by what we'd seen. Over a quick breakfast of toast and bacon, both of us agreed that whatever it was had to be dead. It hadn't moved at all. We stayed up to watch the morning news, expecting it to be reported. This was about 2 hours later, and we figured someone must have come across it by now. But there were no stories about a reptilian body found near the bayou or Port Gibson. Craig went to bed, and I tried to sleep but couldn't. Later that day, and for the next few days, we kept checking the news. The body never came up. I have no idea what could have happened to it. Maybe it was actually alive and we just hadn't noticed. Maybe someone removed it from the road. Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that we either saw a lizard-man hybrid or, like I said, some kind of sick experiment. Whatever it was, we haven't seen anything like it again. Nowadays, Craig still works at the factory, but I got a job in town and thankfully don't drive out on that road often. It was summer in Oklahoma and I was about 10, maybe 11. That day, my grandma picked up me and my younger sister from daycare, and we had gone to eat pizza and then go grocery shopping. By this point, it was right after dark and we were taking the same way home that we did every time. But that night, everything was going to be different. The roads were empty, but that wasn't strange in our county where there wasn't a ton of people. I always loved the way the trees lit up when the headlights hit them, and I was watching them out the window as we drove by, trying to not be dizzy as they raced past. We were in Grandma's truck, and so my little sister was in the middle seat and was playing around with the radio. Par for the course for a little kid. She got bored easily. But what wasn't normal was when Grandma looked up and started pointing. Of course, this caught my attention, and I looked up too, but I couldn't understand why she was freaking out at first. It didn't take me long to figure it out. Up ahead and above the tree line, we could see 3 lights. They were just floating there in the sky. And that's when I noticed that my hair started to float up a bit, like it was staticky and everything just felt wrong. The trees weren't moving. I heard my grandma gasp and then pull off the road and into an open field next to us. We sat in the truck and both watched as this thing stayed in one place, just hanging there in the sky. Also, it was creepy quiet. You couldn't hear any noises coming from the thing, like you would if it was a plane or helicopter, or any animal noises either. It was as if we were in a silent bubble, watching the thing hover there in one place. There was no movement, no wind, just absolute stillness. I couldn't believe my eyes, and Grandma obviously couldn't either. She had opened her door and stood with one foot on the ground and one still in the truck with her hand gripping the steering wheel. She looked like she was ready to jump back in and slam her door at any second. I remember looking over at her and seeing that her grip was so tight that her knuckles were white. My unshakable grandma was obviously shaken. Meanwhile, my little sister was excited about the pretty lights we were looking at. She was too young to know that this wasn't normal. Even though it was still warm from the heat of the day, I shivered and was covered in goosebumps all over my body. My hair still stood on end, and it all just felt wrong. Everything was telling me that we needed to run. I didn't understand how I knew that we needed to get out of there, but I knew it. I was scared and yelled for my grandma to get in the truck, begging her to leave. When she finally heard me, she jumped back in and slammed the truck into gear. The tires spun on the grass before we got traction, but once they grabbed, we were racing home. Even as we put distance between us and that thing, the electric feeling didn't go away. I spun around and it was still in the same spot. Not following us, but it was now spinning. The lights were going around and around, and I could see another light underneath it, like a beam shining down. But aside from spinning, it wasn't moving. It wasn't following us. It wasn't retreating, it just stayed in that one place, spinning faster and faster, like a top. I screamed at her to hurry. I wanted as much distance between us and that thing as possible. My sister then started to cry. She was confused because we were obviously scared and she didn't know why. She was only 4, 5 max, and had never seen 2 people at once being super afraid. When I first decided I wanted to be a park ranger, I had this vision that it was just going to be me and the land. I thought it would be peaceful and quiet. I soon came to find out that half the time I'd be dealing with disorderly people, but still, I got to the point where I enjoyed it for the most part. This was in the early 2000s. I was working as a ranger in Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio. When I started, I knew nothing about Ohio since I'd grown up on the West Coast. A lot of the time, my job involved patrolling campgrounds and parklands at night to ensure visitors were complying with quiet hours. I did a lot of making sure that no fires were being set outside of designated areas. I realized there was no telling what inebriated people would try to do. I had actually volunteered for the 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift when it was available. I was a real night owl. Around 3 a.m. one night, I got an alert from one of the campsites saying they couldn't find their friend. Part of that campground was out on a small peninsula. There were some coves and curved roads that made it easy to get turned around walking to the bathroom at night. It happened a lot. I got there and the friends seemed a little more scared than usual. They said they'd been searching for an hour already and there was no sign of him. They all smelled of alcohol and they all seemed between 18 and 20 years old. I didn't call law enforcement right away because often a drunk person would fall asleep on someone else's chair or picnic table or something. We'd usually find them soon enough and it wouldn't be a big deal. I got to their site and looked around. They were staying in a group site altogether. It was on a finger of a small peninsula consisting of 5 or 6 tent sites. They had 5 tents all around the big fire. There were beer cans everywhere and the fire was still smoldering. Their friend had been sleeping in a tent by himself, while the rest were still sitting around the fire. He'd gotten too drunk and tired himself out, so he had gone to lay down. They said around 2 a.m. they heard him rustling around in the tent. He had puked all over his mattress and inside of the tent. They went to help him out and he had walked into the nearby trees to pee, but then he didn't come back out. The trees were just a narrow strip, maybe 10 wide, bordering the water around the peninsula, so there shouldn't have been much area to get lost in. We kept calling his cell phone. It rang, but there was no answer. I did tend to worry about drowning, so I followed footsteps in the mud, which I assumed were his. They stopped abruptly, well before the water, still in the trees. I looked around, and it didn't seem like he could have jumped anywhere. and most of the trees around there were too big to be climbed, especially if you were drunk. The footsteps just ended. They didn't backtrack or anything. It was a little weird. We kept searching. We all searched until around 4:30 a.m., and then I decided to call it off and told them to wait until morning. It was most likely that he had fallen asleep out of sight somewhere. They went back to their tents to get some sleep. I was way too wired to go home, so I kept at it. I was used to staying up all night anyway. I just wanted to go sit down by the water and stay alert in case I noticed anything. On my way over there, I saw two things dangling down from a tree up ahead. When I got close enough to see them more clearly, I just freaked out and started backing away. They were feet, but they weren't human. I just let out this gasp, and all of a sudden, this thing swooped out of the tree like a bat out of hell. All I could think was that it was some kind of vulture or something. It was gigantic, with probably a 10-foot wingspan. It had flown down to the water's edge with these huge leathery wings. It was at least as tall as me, and I'm 5'10". Then it turned around and looked at me with red glowing eyes. All this happened in a matter of seconds. I realized it wasn't any kind of bird for sure. It didn't look like it had a beak. It didn't even look like it had a face. I just saw darkness and those red eyes glowing out of it. At that point, I became really concerned about the missing dude. I lost it and started yelling at the creature to tell me where the guy was. It turned around and ran along the shore until I couldn't see it anymore. I was sure we were about to find a dead body, but then I heard this rustling in the bushes, and this half-naked person crawls out. It was him. When he was able to make sense, he said he'd gone to the lake to wash the vomit off himself, and that freaky thing had scared him half to death. He'd been under the bushes hiding and had passed out. By then, I felt like I wasn't even in my right mind anymore. I was just fried. I took the kid back to the campsite, went and checked out, and took myself home. I couldn't take it anymore. I had no clue how to even begin making sense of it all. After that, I decided to switch to the day shift, and it ended up being a lot better for me. I just moved into a new house. My parents were, at this point, divorced. I had very few friends, and getting sleep was difficult. But this particular night was different. I fell asleep rather easily. But eventually, I woke up. I'm not sure if it was because I hardly slept before, or if it was because something had made me wake up. Needless to say, I wasn't really surprised. But what did surprise me was the dazed, hazy feeling I felt in my body. I could feel how heavy my eyelids were, so I knew I was still very tired. But that's when I realized the rustling noises. It took me a minute to really understand what was happening. As I mentioned, I was still very much in the early stages of waking up, but the noises didn't make sense, especially not after a long period of hearing it. I tried to see through my blurred vision as best as I could. I thought that maybe my mom had come into my room, or that somehow the cat might have wandered in before I closed the door and went to bed. I couldn't make out much in the dark, but I did notice that there was an unusual shadow towards the end of my room, a bit by my closet. I was still getting used to the layout of my room. So at first, the shadow didn't really bother me. It could have been a chair, a stack of boxes, or something like that. I tried to look towards my bedroom door to see if it was open. That's when I knew something was wrong. I couldn't really move. It's a weird thing, noticing that you are in a state of paralysis, especially at such a young age. It feels like you're strapped down tight, or like you're made out of cement. And no matter how hard you fuss, you don't really get anywhere, except feeling like you're having the most intense workout of your life. A fear starts to build up, and you don't really know what to do other than call for your mom. So that's exactly what I did. I called for my mom. But to my surprise, not a sound passed my lips. I started thinking, okay, I can't move. I can't speak. There's nothing I can do. In a sense, that gave me some relief, knowing that I couldn't do much, so all I could do was lay there. That was until I realized that the shadow by my closet started to move. It's a little surreal because you start to realize how easily you can identify someone by a simple silhouette, even if you had never had to do it before. So, in that instance of the shadow moving, I realized it definitely was not my mom, and it would be impossible if it were my cat. Let me explain. My mom was a petite lady, maybe 5'1" if that. She had hair that was cut to her shoulders, and even though I considered her to be thin, she looked like she had more meat on her bones because of how short she was. This shadow did not resemble her. Not one bit. As the shadow moved closer, I could see more details. The shadow appeared to have the shape of a female. It was very long and thin. It didn't appear to have much muscle mass. And its hair was long, but also very thin, like its limbs. In a way, the shadow looked very malnourished, and so this made me even more fearful because I couldn't identify who it was. Many things ran through my mind as I tried to kick, scream, or move. Anything to make this shadow know that I was able to do something rather than nothing. Was this a woman who came in for warmth? Maybe she doesn't have a home. Maybe she's just squatting. I tried as best as an 8-year-old can to create a plausible reason for this person being in my room in the middle of the night without anyone knowing. But as I tried to reason and tried to scream, the shadow just kept getting closer and closer, until inevitably she started to climb onto my bed. That feeling, the weight of someone else getting into bed with you, that's really scary. It was terrifying because it validated that everything my eyes were seeing was happening. I could feel my throat start to burn from screaming, even though I wasn't able to. But I kept trying anyways. My arms and legs were so tense and stiff, so when the shadow climbed onto my legs, it felt like they were more like a piece of plywood than a part of my actual body. But that didn't make the shadow's cold hands feel any better. I closed my eyes because that seemed to be the only thing I had slight control over, but I could feel her climb onto my chest. She pinned me down. It didn't feel terribly different since I already felt like a cinder block was on top of me, but I could tell that's where she was. And she put her hands around my neck, or it felt that way at least. A weird sensation took hold of me. It was like she was sucking my breath straight out of my lungs. It was very hard to breathe. Between the paralysis, the weight of the shadow, and this feeling that she was sucking my breath out from me, I felt like I was suffocating. I was gasping for air, but I wasn't sure if I was even making a sound. When suddenly it all stopped. No more pressure. No more cold hands. I was able to breathe, but I still didn't move. And I certainly didn't open my eyes. I must have fallen asleep because the sun was shining through the windows, and I could finally move my head, arms, and legs. It was such a relief. And I had never felt so grateful to be able to rub my eyes and get out of bed. It was all just a crazy nightmare. That's what I told myself. But the bruises on my legs and chest told a different story. So I am currently sitting in a hotel 2 cities away from my home. Honestly, I am terrified, and I don't know if I will ever even return there. It is an older house that was built way back in 1953, but it is just so beautiful, so maybe I will go back. I just don't know right now. I've lived there for 2.5 years. I can say I've noticed some small things that should have been warnings. Obviously, I didn't care then. I do now, though. It's all starting to make a lot of sense. I've had times where I put my coffee down on my desk. Then when I go to take a sip, somehow it's on the coffee table. I found drawers and cabinets open, even though I obsessively close them when I am done. I've heard squeaks, creaks, and bangs, but I always just figured it was the wind, or maybe even the house itself since it's so old. Sometimes there was a slight knocking coming from the attic, but again I just thought it was the wind or something. More recently there have been cold spots. Like really cold spots. I made a mental note to have an air conditioner guy come out and take a look. One of my friends stayed the night about a month ago, and they said that it felt like someone was watching them. They also swore that someone was sitting on the bed while they slept. I have cameras in my house, but not in any of the 3 guest rooms or the 2 bathrooms. Anyways, This past Thursday, I came home from work at about 7:30 in the evening. I brought home some sushi and dumplings for dinner. I turned on my favorite internet radio rock station and was sitting down to eat when the air got extremely cold. It was freezing, like so cold that my glass of water frosted over. All of a sudden, my music stopped playing. I spun around to see if someone had walked in and messed with my Bluetooth speaker. No one else was there. Just me, alone, in my dining room. About 30 seconds later, my music blasted back on, way louder than I had it. I jumped probably 10 feet in the air. I told myself that it had to be that the Wi-Fi connection was unstable for a moment and turned back to my table. All of my food was on the other side of the table, exactly as I had left it. Well, mostly, I guess. I am embarrassed to tell you this because any normal person would have left pronto. Everything was as I left it, but it was on the opposite side of the table. I guess I told myself I had just misremembered where I put everything. I don't know. I sat down to finally eat my food, thinking maybe I was just overly hungry and not paying attention to what I was doing. As soon as my butt hit the chair, I heard 3 extremely loud knocks from upstairs, just above the dining room. I ran up the stairs with my chopsticks still in my hand. I stopped at the top landing. Standing in the doorway of the guest bedroom was a man. He was almost see-through. He had this evil smile on his face. His lips were thin and colorless, and his eyes were colorless as well. He looked sick. He was bone-skinny and was wearing dark overalls with no shoes. I was terrified. I've never been terrified before. I wanted to run, but I just couldn't. I couldn't even speak. I don't know how long we were standing there staring at each other. It seemed like forever. My heart was thumping in my ears, and I was freezing. The air around me was so cold I could see my breath. He moved his hand so fast, if I could have moved, I would have jumped clear out of my skin. His skinny, long finger was pointing up to the attic hatch. I felt like I wanted to move. I wanted to open the attic for him. I just couldn't. I didn't even see him move, but now he was standing only about a foot away from me. I heard 3 loud knocks again, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. Somehow I gained use of my legs. I bolted. I don't think I have ever run so fast. Not ever. I grabbed my keys and my cell phone and got out of there. I don't know what happened. What is in my house? Is there something in my attic? Is there someone in my attic? Who was that man? I have no idea. I am still reeling. I haven't left my hotel other than to buy some clothes because I literally left my house with nothing except a set of chopsticks. I've been researching and trying to find help, but so far nothing. My friends all think I've completely lost it. I even sent my camera footage to a few of them, and they say it's a glitch. You can see me just standing there, frozen, then the video is just static for 4 minutes and 27 seconds. I checked my 2 other cameras' footage, and neither of them captured anything from the time I tried to sit down to eat the first time until I run in to get my keys and phone. It is just 9 minutes of static. I'm just really confused and terrified. Knowing that someone has heard my story and has also been through something like this will help me. I know I have to figure it out, and I only have 4 more days of leave time left. Five years ago, when I first got out of the Army and moved to Kentucky, I decided to get a dog. I'd long loved chows, so at the time I figured there was no better opportunity than then to get one. It's hard to find a good chow breeder, but I managed to find one all the way up in South Dakota. She was a gorgeous red chow that I named Foxy. I got a good deal on her from the breeder because she had been saved back for breeding stock, but as it turned out was infertile. So she was already 1.5 years old by the time I brought her back to Kentucky to live with me. This dog wasn't used to the Kentucky woods. She'd lived her life on the flatlands of the prairie, so every time we'd go for a walk in the wooded trails, she was eager to take off ahead of me and search the area. Then every night when we'd get home, I'd spend an hour out in the yard with her picking the burrs and twigs out of her thick fur before I brought her in the house. On this particular day, we'd been at the trails maybe an hour before the sky took on a weird dark gray coloring, and I started noticing flashes of light behind the clouds. It looked strange, like an unusual storm was rolling in, but in a really unusual way. So I called Foxy and we headed back to my truck and headed home. Oddly, though, just a quarter-mile down the road, the sky was clear. I thought about heading back, thinking the storm was passing over quickly, but Foxy was already in the car, and I didn't want to confuse her by heading back again, so we went home. I grabbed the box of grooming tools and sat out on the porch to clean Foxy up, and that's when I noticed the sky overhead was now looking very much the same way it had when we were at the trail. Still, I thought it was just a strange storm brewing and called Foxy over in the hope that we would get her cleaned up and in the house before any rain started pouring down. Chows are a naturally nervous dog, by the way, so at first it didn't really stand out to me that she seemed anxious about the change in the weather. She kept looking at the sky, taking in the distant flashing behind the clouds, and every now and then would let out a deep, low growl. I kept trying to reassure her. "It's okay, girl. Shh." But she just didn't seem to believe me. All at once, though, I got scared too. I watched as something dark came down, lowering itself through the clouds. It never quite came out from behind them fully, but eventually it was close enough to the bottom of the clouds that I could see the shape of it hovering just above the mist. It was large, round, and the flashing lights were attached to it at its ends. Foxy pulled away from me and ran to the edge of the yard, where she was directly below it, and started barking up at the sky. She was obviously protecting me and trying to chase it off. As she stood there barking, a large flash of light came out from under the object, and a beam came through the cloud, zeroing in on her. She was right in the middle of it, barking away, and the beam seemed to be almost magnetized. There was enough static within the beam that her fluffy coat was raising, sticking out every direction. Then it was like a strobe light. Dark light, flashing so quickly I had to squint my eyes to protect myself. It lasted only a moment. Then, when I opened my eyes, skies were clear blue and sunny. There wasn't a cloud up there, and Foxy was gone. I went to my neighbor's house and knocked on their door to get help. I just needed someone else to be helping me deal with this. I also asked them if they'd seen what I'd seen, but they just shook their head no. They said they'd been home all day but had not seen or heard a thing, and that she was just now in the kitchen cooking. And that's when I realized she were making supper, and I looked down at my watch. 4 hours had passed. I don't know how I lost that much time. The strobing only went on for less than a minute, it felt like, and Foxy and I were just getting ready to head in for lunch when it started. Had I really sat on the porch all that time, staring off at nothing? I had no idea how to deal with what I was experiencing, and so headed back home to see if Foxy was back there. Luckily, she was standing on the porch at the front door when I got home. But she had this strange look in her eyes. But even stranger yet was the fact that her fur was still standing on end like it was when I had last seen her. To be honest, it was the better part of a week before it returned to normal. I don't have any good answers for what I experienced that day. I can only hope that whatever it was stays far away from us and we never have to experience it again. Earlier this year, I moved to New Mexico. I'm originally from Philadelphia, and moving out west was a huge culture shock. Between the sheer emptiness of the place and the long drives, I almost felt like I was in another country. I had moved in with my aunt, who lived alone. She was getting older and was finding it hard to take care of herself after my uncle passed away. Since I didn't really have much going on back at home, I volunteered to come out and stay with her for a while and just help with things around the house. I worked remotely anyway. I love my aunt, and the little town she lives in is beautiful, and the locals are all extremely nice, nothing like back home. But it was boring for me because I didn't know anyone. I mean, how much Netflix can you possibly watch? So, looking for something to do, I did the logical thing and made a Tinder profile. I matched up with a few different girls, and some of them were nice enough, but they all lived pretty far away. Eventually, I met this really cute girl named Emily, and we really started hitting it off. She lived 90 minutes away in Santa Fe, which by New Mexico standards was right down the road. A few days later, I ended up driving out to meet her for a date, and we had a blast. We both wanted to see each other again, and I made plans to come back the following Friday. Little did I know that that Friday night would be the most terrifying night of my life. The roads out west are dark. I don't mean dim or kind of hard to see. I mean pitch black, can't see jack. Dark. I was sort of getting used to it, but it still kind of bugged me out. Anyway, Emily had to work until 8 in the evening, so I planned to pick her up from her house around 10. Yeah, I was kind of banking on her letting me stay over, so I didn't have to drive home at 3 in the morning. I had been driving for about 45 minutes and had only passed 2 other cars on the road. The last one had been 20 minutes prior. I was fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station, and subconsciously slowed down quite a bit. That's probably what saved the guy's life. At least initially. I just happened to glance up, and at the last second I saw someone frantically waving their arms in the middle of the road right in front of my car. I slammed on my brakes, but it was too late, and I simultaneously felt and heard the impact. Luckily, they were off to the side a bit, but the person was still hurled back about 10 feet, and my car made a horrific screeching noise as I came to a stop. My Jeep is pretty old and didn't have airbags, but luckily my seatbelt stopped me from slamming my head on the wheel. After a second, I came to the realization that I had just hit someone. I was shaking so badly that it took me a few seconds to unclip my seatbelt, but when I did, I opened my car and ran outside to the body lying in the road. It was a young guy, probably in his early 20s or so. He wasn't wearing a shirt, his jeans were all torn up, and he was missing a shoe. As far as I could tell, he was unconscious but breathing. I ran back to the car to get my cell phone, but of course you don't get service here because I was literally in the desert. I wasn't sure what to do at this point, so I just went back to the guy and crouched down next to him. I got a good look at him at this point and realized he was very unhealthy looking. He was emaciated and looked super sickly. As I sat there for another minute, weighing my options, I heard something coming out of the darkness on the side of the road. It sounded like the growl a house dog would make, only it was throatier, almost like a choking or gargling sound. I don't have the words to really explain, but it wasn't a noise I had ever heard any living creature make. Trying to convince myself it was a coyote or something, I grabbed the guy under the armpits and started dragging him back to my Jeep. I was going to put him in the passenger seat and drive him to the hospital in Santa Fe or flag someone down for help if I got the chance. When I got to the passenger side of the car, I realized the door was locked. Luckily, I was driving with my window down. I laid the guy down gently and walked around to the other side and unlocked the door. I walked to the trunk of my Jeep, thinking maybe I had some clothes or something to cover the guy up with. The least I could do was make him comfortable. Not finding anything useful, I closed the trunk and walked back to the passenger side. The guy was sitting up. His shoulders were pumping up and down rapidly, almost like he was hyperventilating. I was behind him, but it seemed like he was staring at something straight ahead, right where my headlights were pointing. I looked up. This thing was standing in the dead center of the road. It was on all fours, but its hind legs were twice as long as its front, giving it a weird sloping angle. It had a row of needle-thin quills running up its spine, each at least a foot long. It was salivating something viscous and black, steam rising from the pavement wherever it dripped in thick clumps. Even hunched down the way it was, it still had to be taller than me, and I stood 6'1". We were completely still at this point, almost like we were waiting for the other to act, so this guy decided it would be him, I guess. He let out a scream that seemed like it filled the entire desert. I don't know how he did it, but 1 second he was sitting down, and the next he was sprinting off the road into the darkness. The creature opened its mouth impossibly wide and let out its own scream, perfectly mimicking the tone and pitch the guy had just made. I bolted for the back of the Jeep. I felt something hard slam into the hood, and I just stood crouched in silence. I waited a few moments, the whole time hearing the guy screaming repeatedly, getting farther and farther away. I couldn't see the dude or the creature. My heart was pounding and I was trying not to throw up. After a few moments, I stood up, looked through the rear windshield, and didn't see anything. I crept up along the side of my car, got to the door, and quietly opened it. Then I heard that same scream again, this time right behind me. One hand on the door, I pulled it shut behind me as I dove into the car. Something hard hit the side of my Jeep, and for a split second I thought I was going to tip. I never turned the car off, so I just reached down with my hand and pushed down on the gas. Of course, the car was in park and the engine just strained like it was about to burst. I reached up with my other hand, shifted into drive, and my car leapt forward. I drove about 50 feet, shifted myself so I was sitting, and then waited. He never came back. I can't be certain, but there is a good chance that this guy is dead, and I'm partly, if not totally, to blame. I never went to see Emily that night. I drove till I hit an intersection and just ended up taking the long way back to my aunt's. There is something unnatural out there in the New Mexico desert. This story happened in New York City, and I haven't had a good night's sleep since. I was friends with a group of 3 guys who like to identify themselves as urban explorers. They would root out abandoned warehouses and factories, open manholes, and walk through the subway tunnels. They didn't really have any goal that I was aware of. I guess they just liked the sense of adventure. I had listened to a bunch of their stories and asked if I could join them on their next excursion, to which they agreed. I'm not sure why I did it and would later come to completely regret it. We had decided to explore a little stretch of abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of one of the boroughs. I'm not going to give specifics. I don't want to be responsible for anyone else getting hurt. The night came, I caught the bus and met them about half hour's walk away. These guys traveled light, just some headlamps and flashlights, though one guy actually had a crowbar. The property around the buildings was fenced off, but it must have been ages since anyone had come to inspect it. There were plenty of openings we could slip through and even found a spot that looked like it was completely torn open. There was lots of graffiti and litter all over the place, but we didn't see anyone else. We headed to the closest warehouse, a 5-story brick building with all of the windows smashed in or missing. There wasn't even a door, so we're able to walk right in. And honestly, it was pretty underwhelming. I guess it was cool for the first few minutes, almost like walking through a little piece of recent history. But after you've seen one empty and dusty room, then you've seen them all. In one of the rooms, we found a few garbage bags filled with odds and ends and a few blankets. Probably some poor guy who was down on his luck and sleeping here. But again, there wasn't anybody around. We walked all around the building, going all the way to the roof. The view was nice, but I was ready to just leave and call it a night. But once we got back to the main floor, we found a door that we must have missed the first time. It wasn't locked, but it was wedged pretty tight. We all took turns trying to unsuccessfully open it until Crowbar Guy earned his name and popped it open. It was pitch black, but we had our headlamps and could see that it was a flight of stairs that led straight down. There was also an odd, slightly rotten smell coming from below. I felt a little uneasy, but this was the kind of stuff these guys lived for. They didn't hesitate and just started walking down the stairs. I didn't want to wait up here by myself, so I followed. The staircase went on for longer than I had expected, and by the time it leveled off, I couldn't even tell how far we had come. The smell was much more intense now. I actually had to take my beanie off and hold it over my nose and mouth. It didn't really help. It was obvious that this place was pretty much untouched since being abandoned. There were a bunch of desks and chairs along with stacks upon stacks of paperwork and random supplies. The basement was roughly the size of the main floor, making it pretty expansive. I had a really bad feeling, but the other guys weren't hearing it, and as we went deeper, the smell became almost unbearable. Eventually, we came to the widest room we had found yet, and what we saw made me sick to my stomach. A human body, was lying on the floor in the middle of the room. Hunched over it was something I can't logically explain. It had pale gray flesh, almost white. Its hands were inside of the body, moving around like they were searching for something. It didn't have ears or a nose that I could see, only a pair of bloodshot red eyes that latched onto us as soon as it saw us. Everything stopped for a few seconds, my group and the creature just staring at each other. Then I threw up. It just happened. I don't know if it was the sight in front of me, the smell, or pure fear. But I puked all over the floor. My sudden movement and the noise but have startled the beast because a moment later it was standing straight up, its head almost touching the 8-foot-high ceiling. One of the guys started yelling, and I felt a hand grab me from behind and pull me around. We all started running. This thing let out terrible screams behind us, like it was trying to yell with fluid in its mouth. It must have been chasing us, because a few times I could hear slamming noises from behind us, like it was kicking the furniture out of the way, but I didn't dare look back. We made it to the bottom of the stairs, and I was the last one in the group. Just as I ducked under the door frame, something slammed into the wall beside my head. I don't know what it was, but it made a wet thud as it impacted. I raced up through the door onto the main floor, and one of the other guys was waiting to slam the door behind me. I just kept running out into the yard, and everybody caught up a moment later. We ran to the fence line, ducked through a hole, and only then decided to look back. There was no sign of the creature. When we all took a moment to calm down, we started talking about what we just saw and what we should do. None of us even had an inkling what that thing was, but we could all agree that it was not a human. I said that we needed to go to the police, that somebody had died in that building, but one of the other guys said, "No, man, think about how it would look." Were we really going to go to the police and tell them that some kind of monster was eating a homeless person in the basement of an abandoned building? Even if they believed us and went to the building, what would happen? If they found the body, would they think it was us? We weren't even supposed to be there in the first place. I'm ashamed to admit it, but he was right. We didn't go to the police and we didn't tell anybody. I didn't really see those guys too much after this incident, and as far as I know, that was the end of their urban exploration. I know it sounds crazy. It is crazy, but it happened just like I told it. Stay out of places like this. God only knows what else lurks in the dark corners and basements of civilization. I saw something when I was 11 years old, and I've been scared to look in a mirror ever since. The Conjuring came out in 2013, and it was somewhat of a cultural phenomenon. Maybe it just seemed that way because it's all anybody talked about. Growing up, my parents were the most strict out of all my friends. This meant monitored internet access, limited late-night outings, and certainly no R-rated movies. So you can only imagine 11-year-old me and my excitement to have gotten the green light to stay the night at my friend's house, one fall night for a Halloween party. I showed up to the party sporting my best Harry Potter attire, and everybody else's costumes looked equally amazing. We carved pumpkins, danced to the Monster Mash, and ate way too much candy. When it came time for lights out, we all huddled in the basement, pulled out our pillows and blankets, and made ourselves cozy. The sleepover party portion of the night operated as you'd expect, considering it consisted of 7 or so middle schoolers. We had pizza and soda and talked about other kids in our grade. That was until my friend's older brother, Skylar, came downstairs with 2 of his friends, suggesting we watch a movie. Despite Skylar being only a couple years older than me, it felt as though he and his friends were worlds apart. That's why it came as no surprise that one of the boys had a copy of The Conjuring and insisted it would be the perfect movie to watch at a Halloween party. Even though I didn't really like scary movies, I was not going to be the one to suggest we watch something else. Like I said, this movie was all the rage at the time, and I think we knew that watching it and being able to talk about it at school would make the party 10x cooler. Looking back, I wish my mom was there to put a stop to the whole thing. Because there is no reason, I should still get goosebumps thinking about that night nearly 15 years later. Let me preface this by saying my friend's house was creepy as hell. The mere fact that we had to sleepover party in the basement should already have alluded to that. The house must have been built in a different century. The floors creaked as you walked around. The lights flickered at random times. There was a furnace in the basement, the only plus side of sleeping down there, as it was the warmest place in the house. But really, the worst part of it all was the abundance of antique paintings and knickknacks scattered around the home. I'm talking old porcelain dolls with cracks in their faces, armoires filled with vintage dishes and magazines, portraits of previous homeowners who must have been dead for ages. So yeah, it was the perfect place for a Halloween party, but not somewhere I would want to live on a regular basis. And certainly not somewhere that would make watching a scary movie any less terrifying than it already was. The Conjuring was easily the scariest movie I have seen, possibly because I steer clear of scary things. But even back then, I remember having consoled my one friend because of the plot twists and jump scares in this film. When all was said and done, it must have been past 1 a.m. But fortunately, within the next 30 minutes or so, everyone had fallen asleep. That was, everyone besides me. My mind was fixated on the fact that The Conjuring was based on a true story. And when I was doing my best not to think of that, the only other thing that popped into my head was how badly I needed to pee and how the bathroom was upstairs. Cutting to the chase, I was faced with a series of which is worse type scenarios. Was it worse to attempt to wake up one of my friends to come with me because I was too scared to go upstairs alone? Was it worse to wet the bed when I realistically knew there was no way I could hold it until morning? Was it worse to face my fears and just go upstairs alone? Ultimately, I chose the latter because either of the former just sounded embarrassing. I really couldn't afford to have this sleepover go bad when I was rarely invited to events like this anyway, and even rarer, allowed to attend. It took me every bit of 10 minutes to work up the courage to get up the stairs, and that's when all eyes were on me. Every porcelain doll in the living room felt like it was shooting targets through me, and frankly, I felt like I could hurl. I wasted no more time skating to the bathroom and slamming the door shut behind me despite having done my best to keep quiet. I did my business, went to wash my hands, and nearly leapt out of my skin when I glanced up at the mirror. For a split second, a grimacing, almost blurry figure was hovering behind me. But in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I washed my hands faster than you can even imagine, flung open the door, prepared to sprint back down to the basement, and that's when I saw it. The same figure in the mirror, semi-transparent, grimacing, and dark. I remember feeling instantaneously cold, and the air around me seemed to go still. I slammed the door and screamed a scream so vile, I had no doubt it woke the neighbors. The next few minutes passed in a blur, and it's hard to sort the memories through the haze. All I know is eventually my friend's parents came crashing into the bathroom, pleading for me to tell them what was wrong, but I was in a trance. My mom picked me up that night, and I've never been so happy to see her in my life. Needless to say, I never went to that place again, nor did I engage with scary movies or sleepovers until well into my high school years. I can't say for sure what it was I saw that night. All I know is its presence was demonic and felt like something straight out of The Conjuring. In the mid-2000s, I was attending college at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Growing up in Iowa, I'd always wanted to find a way to be closer to the ocean. So, I loved the location and figured I'd get plenty of time to explore. But then I always felt so overwhelmed with studying and assignments, and it ended up that I seemed to spend most of my time inside. Anyway, my roommate Amanda and I decided to abandon our schoolwork one weekend and finally go have an adventure. We decided to go to Assateague Island. It's a barrier island and a refuge for a lot of different wildlife. I was most excited to check out the feral ponies I'd heard about. There don't really seem to be many places where you can see wild horses. We decided to camp even though it was the off-season and would be pretty chilly. At least there were no crowds. We borrowed a bunch of gear from our hardcore camping friend and headed out. We stopped at the visitor center and the rangers told us where we would be likely to see the horses. They told us just to make sure we put away all of our food items whenever we were away from the campsite. We showed them the bear-proof cooler we had borrowed, and they said that was fine. We set up our camping spot and went to the recommended trail. When we were out there, we caught sight of horses off in the distance. They had told us to stay at least 40 feet away from them, but we were able to get a good look. We were happy to get a not-too-distant view of horses across an inlet. But then we were really excited when the herd stormed through the water and toward the area where we were standing. We must have seen 3 different herds while we were hiking around that morning. We had some binoculars so we could spot them in the distance. We were satisfied with our sightings by noon. We took the rest of the day to have a cookout and just relax on the beach. I was ready for bed early and got in my sleeping bag right after sunset with my book. I must have fallen asleep right away. Next thing I knew, I was woken by something howling. I'm familiar with coyotes and wolves, but this didn't sound like that. It was higher and screecher and gave me goosebumps all over, and I could have sworn it was getting closer. I convinced myself it must be one of the island foxes. I fell asleep again, but then this horrible growling woke me again. It was really low and guttural. I could hear something rustling around outside of the tent. It was probably half an hour before the noises stopped, and I could sleep again. The next day, we decided to take the wildlife loop trail. It was maybe 3 miles long and gave good views of the marsh and the forest. We ended up staying out there a long time exploring. By the time we decided to go back to camp, we were both pretty tired, and it was almost sunset. We came over the crest of a dune and could see our tent a ways away. It looked like it was fluttering in the wind more than it should be. I could tell there was some stuff on the ground by the tent. I remember saying how weird that was. We got closer and could see the tent door was hanging unzipped and flapping around. The stuff on the ground was a bunch of our stuff, our sleeping bags and clothes. What the hell? We were thinking someone had come to rob us. We knew we hadn't left any food unsecured. It didn't seem like the work of an animal because the zippers were just pulled down like a person would do. Inside the tent, there were big muddy prints all over the floor. If I didn't know better, I would think they were from a giant dog. Our bags had been opened and all the contents had been removed and thrown around. All the food that had been securely locked inside the cooler was gone, and everything was covered with sand and mud. We were just mystified. Then I heard that howl that I'd heard the night before. I was instantly petrified. I can't tell you how primal it sounded. Me and Amanda rushed out and heard it coming from toward the trees. We both screamed when we saw this huge werewolf-looking creature. It was obviously eating something. It looked like a 6 or 7 foot tall wolf, but it had the torso of a man. I had my binoculars around my neck. It had a long snout and sharp fangs. When it howled, it sounded a lot like a human scream. It was facing sideways to us, so I couldn't really see its eyes, but its back was kind of hunched and it had massive shoulders. It never looked toward us. It seemed to finish what it was eating and turned away and went into the trees. We were literally shaking from the shock of seeing that thing. We knew we had to leave. We pulled everything out of the tent and shook it off as best we could and threw everything in the trunk. We raced out of there and we did stop at the ranger station, but it was after hours and we couldn't see anyone around. We didn't know what to do. We ended up going home and called them the next day and described what we saw. I have no idea if they took us seriously or thought we were just seeing things. When you live on a farm in Texas, you hear all kinds of crazy stories. Stories of things that you can't quite explain. You always laugh and say, yeah, okay, whatever, until it happens to you. Then you become that crazy person telling the story. I was helping a family friend out on their farm. They ran cows, horses, a few goats, and chickens. Pretty typical for a family farm in Texas, right? I remember we were all sitting around after a long, hard day. I was sunburnt and cranky, but I was still adjusting to the Texas heat. In my opinion, there is a real difference between it and heat anywhere else. But anyway, we were sitting around talking about our day. My friend started telling us about what happened to him the night before. He had gone out to check the cattle because something had woken him up. He had just made it to the fence line when he started hearing something strange and realizing that the animals were shifting uncomfortably. He figured we had some coyotes out and let the dogs loose for some protection. He listened and watched a bit but didn't hear anything else, and the dogs didn't react to anything, so he headed back to bed. As we listened, we basically just shrugged the story off. Coyotes aren't uncommon and the dogs help keep the herd safe, so we weren't too worried. This was all pretty common. We had done a herd count as per the usual when making our morning and nightly rounds, and everyone was accounted for. We wrapped up our post-work hangout and all headed into the house for bed. However, that didn't last long. It was only a few hours later when I heard a horse scream. If you have never heard a horse scream, count yourself lucky. I jumped up and raced outside, but didn't hear anything more. I didn't let that fool me, though. I knew that something was out there because horses are very intuitive. I grabbed my flashlight and woke my buddy up. He was an insanely deep sleeper, telling him to get up and grab his gun. I didn't know what we were going to find, but we were going to find out. He threw on his boots and we headed to the pasture. All of the animals were on high alert. The horses were tossing their heads, snorting and frantically stomping their feet. The cattle were milling about, staying close together and snorting. I had never seen the animals act this way, not over a coyote at least. I pointed my flashlight towards the back of the field, swiping it left and right. I couldn't see anything, but the anxiety pouring off the livestock was thick. I could almost taste it. It was starting to set me on edge also. I jumped the gate and walked along the fence line, ready to jump out if they started to panic. I did not want to get trampled. I was about 20 steps in when I saw movement. I couldn't make out what I was seeing, but it was fast and it stayed in the shadows. I walked closer, trying to shine the light where I had last seen movement, but couldn't catch anything. I started to give up and let my buddy know that whatever it was gone, and that we should bring the horses in for the night. But that's when I heard it. It was growling low and deep, but it was also loud. It made me jump and my hands started shaking. I began backing up, not wanting to take my eyes from where it had been. I didn't want to lose sight of it, but I also wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, glowing eyes had appeared low to the ground, and they were staring back at me. I heard one of the horses behind me snort and felt the air rushing past me as they started to run and mill around. They could sense something was wrong, all while I was watching something I couldn't understand form in front of me. I kept my flashlight low to the ground as the eyes grew larger. I knew it was getting close. I raised the light quickly and screamed like a banshee when I saw a dog-like creature creeping towards me with no fur, completely naked. But what scared me the most was the long, sharp claws and fangs. I started stuttering, trying to talk to my buddy to get him over to me. I seriously couldn't believe my eyes. I had always laughed when people told their stories. But then, this. As I watched, the creature stalked towards me, opening its fang-filled mouth and growling. Luckily, I realized that my buddy had stayed outside of the fence, but he was now screaming at me to get out of there. He was afraid to take a shot and hit me or one of the horses. I started running backwards, one hand on the fence rail to guide me. I didn't want to take my eyes off this thing again. Finally, I made it back to the gate and to where my friend was. He took the flashlight and kept it aimed exactly where I had it. I climbed over the gate so as not to take any chances about losing a frightened animal, and by the time I came down on the other side, the creature was gone. I was shaking and stuttering. I don't think I have ever been that scared. We agreed to go wake everyone up. We needed to do a count and make sure we had someone on guard in shifts. As we all made our way back out to the pastures, everything was calm. None of the animals were on alert. The dogs were even silent as they ran ahead of us. Nothing seemed wrong, at least not at first. We started our count, and quickly discovered we were short one horse. The cows and goats were all there, but we were missing one of the mares. So we started the hunt for her. She couldn't have gone too far. It didn't take long to find her. We had barely started walking the pasture when one of the other hands yelled out. We all ran over, and there she was, but she was gone, with only 3 puncture wounds in her neck. We spent the rest of the night working in shifts to protect the rest of the herd. It was a long, sad, scary night. one I would never want to relive. I can't laugh anymore when I hear about the crazy sightings out there. I have lived it. It isn't made up. It is scary and it's real. When I was 17, I saw something that to this day gives me chills. Ever since I was a child, I loved being in the water. I was on my community swim team since I was 5 years old, which eventually turned into me joining a travel team and competing in the tri-state area around New Jersey. Naturally, when I got to high school, I was excited to join the swim team and continue perfecting my craft. This passion eventually led me to get a job as a lifeguard at my local beach, where I got paid to be around or be in the water. Could a job really get better than that? Because I wasn't able to work until I finished school and practice for the day, I took the later shift at the beach, meaning the sun would start setting before the end of my shift. When it started getting near sunset, I would clear the water, turn off the beach lights, and call it a night. While people technically could sneak back onto the beach after I closed up, it typically didn't happen. There's a certain risk to swimming by yourself, especially at night, so most people were content with just heading home once the sun set. Me, on the other hand, I loved taking a dip after my shift. I was pretty confident in my swimming abilities, and the water at the beach was relatively calm. So it didn't much bother me to be in the ocean by myself, even in the dark, since I didn't wade too far out anyway. One Friday evening following my shift, when the beach was empty, I found myself floating in the ocean, washing away the stresses of the week. As I floated on my back and looked up into the sky, the stars were abundant, and I remember thinking I'd never felt peace quite like I was feeling in that moment. I was humming to myself as the water lapped over my arms, when suddenly something caught my eye. Darting across the sky, then pausing directly above my field of vision, was a tiny bright green light. At first, I thought it was just a tiny insect hovering above me, maybe a discolored lightning bug who'd found itself too far away from the shore. But reaching up into the air, I became more confident that this thing I was seeing was no bug, but something miles away. Many miles. Maybe a shooting star. Maybe. But whatever it was, it seemed to hover right above me indefinitely, and I thought shooting stars typically fizzled out pretty quickly after hay appeared. Suddenly I watched while 5 purple lights shot out from the single green light. They then formed a circle around the single light and began rotating counterclockwise. The display was hypnotizing to say the least. But deep in my gut, I started feeling as though something wasn't right. There was no occasion to be setting off fireworks or any reason for strobe lights to be dancing in the air. In fact, peering back towards the shore, I could see the beach town was eerily dark. Not a person or party in sight. And with this, the mesmerizing lights began to turn rather terrifying to me, because now I was running out of justification for them. As if in response to my growing fear, the lights stopped circling and suddenly converged into one blindingly bright beam. The beam transitioned from green to yellow to white, and a quick look around had me convinced that it was pointing directly into the water at me. It's difficult to describe the emotions that overcame me in that moment, but for all the strength I could manage, I knew I needed to get out of the water, and I needed to do so fast. Suddenly the beam began to grow as if it were coming closer, and instinctively my body sank underwater. Realistically, I know the water wasn't going to protect me from whatever was tracking me from above, but I did know the water was cloudy and could give me a false sense of security under its haze. I held my breath longer than I'd ever done before and fought against the little current in a dire effort to make it back to shore. My mind and body were in conflict with each other. My body wanted to flail as fast as humanly possible, while my mind warned to keep calm and not create a lot of movement. As I continued swimming, I could see the light from the beam above refracted into the water around me, but moving around in what I presumed to be searching motions. It was not shining directly onto me anymore, and whether or not that was thanks to me retreating into the water or not, I didn't care. I just wanted to remain as shadowed as possible. Finally, when I reached the shallows, I was unable to rely on the water for protection any longer. I shot out of the ocean and onto the beach and ran as fast as humanly possible across the sloshing wet sand. All the while I was looking up at the beam in the sky, which was now again surrounded by colorful spinning lights, and began screaming at the top of my lungs for help. My commotion must have been deafening, and as I continued sprinting up the beach, lights in the surrounding beach homes began to flicker on, and silhouettes filled the windows. I waved frantically, begging anyone for assistance, when finally my legs gave out and I found myself face up in the sand once more looking at the lights. I can't say for sure what caused what happened next, but suddenly the lights converged into themselves once more, but instead of turning into a beam, they condensed back into that single green light I'd initially seen before shooting off into the distance and disappearing amongst the stars in the sky. In an instant, I was surrounded by people from the beach houses who were wrapping me in towels, picking me up and carrying me to the safety of their homes. They all were rather panicked, having feared I'd been attacked by a shark, and were asking me if I was hurt. It took a minute to finally catch my breath, but once I had, I told them a story that left me far more shaken than the mere threat of a shark attack ever has. I lived in a pretty rural development that backed up to a national forest in Northern California. My house was toward the end of a cul-de-sac, so we didn't get a lot of cars coming through, except for people coming home after work. What made our neighborhood really interesting was the old De Hoyt place at the end of the street. It was the perfect poster child for a haunted house. The iron fence was a little rusty, the windows were big and covered over. Even the yard looked like it was haunted because of the crazy long grass and big bushes growing in weird places. All of us kids knew to stay away from it. I mean, to us the house looked like an axe murderer lived there. So there we are, all of us kids in the neighborhood, maybe about 10 of us, and somebody has a great idea to play kickball in the street. Fine. We go on having fun until Mark kicked the thing too hard and it went over the fence and into the De Hoyt yard. I do remember that we all stopped and stared at him and then turned around to look at the De Hoyt place. The grass was so high, I couldn't even see where the ball had landed. Mark refused to go get the ball. He said it was because we weren't supposed to trespass, but I think it was just because he was scared. All the kids started nudging one another. "You go get it." Well, some angel must have been looking out for me, because that was when my mom called me into dinner, so I had a great excuse to say I couldn't do it. After dinner, though, there was still plenty of daylight left, so we got booted back outside. We couldn't play kickball anymore, though, thanks, Mark, and nobody was brave enough to hop the fence and go look for the ball. No problem. We decided to play hide and seek instead. We did a few rounds of hide and seek, and one of the kids was seriously a champion hider. It took forever to find her. Our games dragged on until the streetlights came on. I'm competitive, so I wanted to win at least one game tonight. If it couldn't be kickball, it was going to have to be hide and seek. I knew somebody's parents were going to start calling them home, and then we'd have to stop, and I'd go to bed a loser. I didn't want that. So I talked my friends into one last game. Mark was it. He started counting, and everybody scattered. Except me, because I'd thought of the perfect place to hide. I pretended to hide across the street, but as soon as I saw most of my friends hide, I ran for the end of the street. The fence was too tall for me to jump, but the gate had been locked with a padlock and chain, an old one. It was open just enough, and I was just skinny enough to squeeze through. I remember thinking something weird, that being in the De Hoyt yard felt weird. That is the only thing I can think of to call it. It felt like I was being watched. That creepy feeling made me not want to go deep into the yard, but I figured I didn't have to. I ducked into the tall weeds by the fence and waited. I heard Mark yell out, "Here I come!" And then I remember hearing feet pounding the pavement. Still weird that it kind of felt like sound was muffled, even though I was really close to the fence. My hiding place was pretty airtight, though, because I kept hearing "got you" for a while. I think it was about 10 minutes. I was starting to congratulate myself on winning the game when I heard, "Hey, there's still 2 missing!" Then someone's front door opened, and I heard a parent yell for Devin and Amanda to come inside. The others started really hunting for us because we were just so close to being done with the game. I really didn't want to make it this far and lose, and since I was close to the fence, if they got close enough, I'd be spotted. I figured I'd sort of army crawl backward to get into better cover. There was a big bush nearby, so I backed toward it. By now it was pretty dark, and I couldn't really see the kind of bush I was hiding by, just the branches hanging low near my face. It had a lot of thick leaves, and it was really tall. Belly down on the ground like I was, all I could smell was dirt and crushed grass and some weird musky smell. It smelled like a wet dog, but not quite, which I remember thinking was kind of weird, because we hadn't had the sprinklers on in a while, and I didn't remember seeing any dogs out. And then I heard a growl. It was a deep sound, like a really big dog. I'd always heard people say that the hair on the back of their neck stood up when they were scared, but I'd never had it happen to me. Well, it was happening now. The big bush rustled, but it sounded like something was pushing the branches, not just the wind blowing. That wet dog musk smell got stronger, and I didn't dare turn my head to look, but I just knew that something was looking at me. Then that growl came again, deep and close. I don't remember what happened next. I don't remember how I got out of there. All I know is I was suddenly outside the fence and running for my house like monsters were chasing me, screaming that there was something horrible at the De Hoyt house. It took my parents a long time to get me to calm down, and even then I refused to go near the windows or doors until they were closed and locked. My dad said I probably ran into a bear, and I was lucky to get away. My brother said it was just a dog and I was being a baby. But I don't think it was either of those. Later, I did some research on weird things in the area and found some information on Sasquatch. It described the same musky, wet dog smell I'd smelled that night. The growling, too. I told my dad what I found, but he didn't believe me. No one did. I've never gone into any woods past dark since... My parents own a large ranch out here in Wyoming. On it, they have their own house at one end of the property. I fixed up and took over an old ranch hand's house on opposite end and live here by myself. The ranch is large enough that neither house is visible to each other, but it's an easy, quick drive in a car or ranch vehicle. So it was November when everything happened. I had just finished making some food for a potluck dinner with friends and was washing the dishes when I heard a knock on the door. I looked through the glass along the side of the door to see who it could be. I assumed it would be my mother coming to rant about my father like she often did. But it was two younger kids. They stood right next to each other, both looking down towards their feet. One looked to be maybe 13, and he had dark brown hair and pale skin. The other was a younger girl with two long pigtail braids. She might have been 9 or 10. I opened the main door, but left the screen door between us, shut and locked. I asked them what they were up to, being friendly and approachable because they were just kids. It struck me as weird that they were out wandering around so late. It was around 9:30 in the evening, but I know some of the neighbors have rowdy kids, so I assumed that's who these guys were. I remember them responding saying, "We're lost, can we come in and wait for our parents?" Their tone was completely void of emotion, and that rubbed me the wrong way. Like if they were lost kids, they'd sound afraid, right? I asked them if they called their parents, and they said, "Our parents are on their way. Can we wait inside, please?" I was very hesitant to let them in, but I always try to be helpful when I can, so I unlocked the door and let them inside. I mean, they were kids after all. I gestured for them to have a seat in the living room, and they both walked over. The little one grabbed the older one's hand as they sat down. I asked them where their parents were, and if they lived near me. I thought maybe I could just drive them next door or something if need be. The older one looked at me with a completely emotionless face and said, "Our parents are on their way." I felt sick when I made eye contact with this kid. His eyes were not normal. They were pitch black, like looking into a deep well that you can't see the bottom of. The hairs on my arms and neck stood up, and I instantly regretted letting them in. The little one stood up and asked me to use the bathroom. Her eyes were just as dark as the boys'. Something was seriously wrong, but I said yes and pointed to the bathroom door. Both of them went in together, and I quickly rushed to my phone. I texted my parents so I wouldn't raise any alarm with the children. Something was very, very wrong, and I didn't want to risk angering them. But I got a message back saying the text message failed to send. I'd never had any issues with reception on the ranch, so that was weird. The light flickered in my house for a moment, then the power cut out completely. I heard thudding and crashing from inside the bathroom, almost like the kids were knocking things over in the dark. I feel bad for saying this, but I had no desire to help them. I wanted to run as far away from those creepy kids as I could, actually. I turned the light on my cell phone on and pointed it towards the hallway where the bathroom was and nearly fell backwards from shock. Both of the kids were standing there holding hands just outside the bathroom door, staring at me. "Our parents are here," the boy said. They both walked right out the door. I peeked through the window and watched them walk off towards the road and get into a car. The lights flickered back on shortly after it pulled away. I drove over to my parents' house and told them what happened, but they were asleep and didn't notice a power outage. I saw the time on their microwave was flashing at 12:05, so I knew they must have had one too. I tried to explain it away as a weird coincidence, but I know there was something supernatural about the situation. After seeing those kids, some of the cattle on the ranch have gone missing. My father and I are always careful about locking the barns and pens and making sure every animal is accounted for, so that was unusual. We take excellent care of our animals. They receive regular veterinary care, especially the pregnant moms. One of our pregnant goats, who was having a normal and healthy pregnancy, had an entire stillborn litter just weeks before we were expecting her to give birth. I've been feeling extra fatigued lately, so I went to the doctor because it was unusual. I'm a healthy 25-year-old who eats well and gets plenty of exercise daily. They couldn't figure out what it was right away, but they're highly considering lupus. I haven't seen or heard from those two since that night, but I do know now that they weren't any neighbor's kids. We went to a BBQ down the road since that night, and I asked the neighbors if they knew of or had seen any kids matching that description, and they'd never heard of them or seen them. And now, since that experience, I've heard strange tapping on some of my windows, followed by flickering lights and weird disturbances in my electronics. Sometimes I think I see stuff out of the corner of my eyes, but I can't figure out if it's real or just my paranoia. Hopefully, I'll find a way to get past all of this. It was 1975, and we were just kids living in the suburbs of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'd say we were around the ages of 10 and 12. Basically, we were old enough to ride around on our bikes without supervision, but looking back, we weren't old enough to fully comprehend what had happened that day. My friend and I had been wanting to go for a bike ride for a while. I had gotten a new bike for my birthday, so I really wanted to test it out. There was this area that we knew about. It was typically for older kids, but I had heard my sister talking about it, and I really wanted to go. So my friend and I gathered some snacks and comic books, and we decided that we were going to go up there for a few hours. I had told my mom that we would be at their house, and they told their mom that we would be at my house. It was your typical lie you'd tell your parents to allow yourselves enough time to do whatever mischief you had set out to do without getting in trouble. So we met at the park. At this point, we are really excited to start our adventure. The only issue was we had to be back home before dinner, and we definitely had to be back before the older kids went up there. Basically, we went up there before it started to get dark. But the sky was already turning an orange color, so we knew we didn't have much time. I guess we were so excited about our trip that we wasted a good amount of it packing things we wouldn't really need anyways. So, we start riding our bikes. Like I said, the sky had a bit of orange, but the sky was mostly still blue. It only took us about 10 minutes to ride our bikes from the park to our destination, so it wasn't too difficult. We get to the spot, and at first I'm looking at this place like, is this really where the older kids hang out? It looked pretty gross, and the place reeked of sewage. But basically, it looked like some type of creek with a strange cement tunnel. But I looked at my friend. They gave me the thumbs up, meaning that this was indeed the place. My friend looked excited, so I tried my best to look excited too, even though I was slightly disappointed. We parked our bikes up on the slope. And as the slope went down, it created a type of creek, like I said. So we grabbed our backpacks and headed down to the area towards the creek and tunnel. As we got further down, the smell just got worse and worse. But it didn't seem to bother my friend, and I didn't want to seem like a wimp, so I tried not to let the smell bother me. We get to the tunnel and you can tell that teenagers hung out down there. The walls were covered in profanity, images of women's breasts and what have you, and there were a bunch of cigarette butts and alcohol cans all over the place. We did feel a little cooler since we actually made it to the place and had a better idea of what went on there. We decided that the tunnel would be like our fun clubhouse, so we found a decently clean area to set our stuff down, and we started unpacking our things. The sky was much more orange now, so we knew we wouldn't be able to stay much longer, but I like to draw, and I wanted to try and redraw some of the stuff I saw on the walls. It wasn't the most appropriate stuff to draw, but hey, I was a kid. I thought I was so cool. So I'm doodling away. Me and my friend are giggling, just having a good time in the tunnel, and every sound is really amplified there. So our laughter is just so loud. I'm actually really surprised that my parents didn't hear us all the way at my house. That's how loud everything sounded. Anyways, we are laughing, and I sort of hear the faint sound of, like, footsteps. So I stopped laughing. My friend stops too, and they look at me. I think they were confused. But I was really nervous that the teenagers had found us, or that someone like an adult from the area caught us doing things we shouldn't be doing. So my heart is just racing. I whisper to my friend, "We should start packing up." They nod, and we start stumbling around trying to get all of our things. That's when I heard it. It sounded like a woman's heels on the cement. It sounded like they were in the tunnel with us. I start freaking out because I really didn't want to get into trouble. I just got my new bike. My parents were finally letting me be gone till dark. So I turn around. Down the tunnel to the farthest side that we had not ventured to, there was the silhouette of something so strange. I can't really explain it all that well, but I'll do my best. It was somewhat hunched over, or it looked hunched over to me at least. It appeared to have hair on its head, and honestly, it seemed to go onto its shoulders and back. Let me rephrase. It didn't have long hair. The hair was somewhat short and matted down, but it looked like they had hair growing from its back and shoulders too. Its legs, they weren't human. They looked like they belonged to a goat or horse. And these two had hair that seemed to be a similar length as the top of its head. And on the top of its head, it appeared to have two pointy objects sticking out from the hair, with what looked like two ears that seemed again like they belonged to a goat. So I'm thinking to myself, is this a goat? But that's when the thing stood up tall on its hind legs. And it definitely wasn't a goat. But it absolutely wasn't a human either. I looked at my friend, and they were shaking. The thing took another step towards us, and we didn't give it more time for another. We took our backpacks and ran. We ran so fast I honestly couldn't even remember going back up that hill or riding our bikes home. I'm not sure what was down in that tunnel, but I was certain that I would never return. And I haven't. Back in my 20s, I worked as a tree planter up in Flathead County in Montana. It's the hardest job I've ever had. You have to hike over a lot of uneven ground carrying 30 to 40 pounds of trees hanging in bags off your hips. And you have to bend down to plant them over and over. It's not that uncommon to have forest fires flare up when you're out planting. Some areas are so dry that anything can set them off. Even a spark from one of our shovels hitting a rock could be a concern. You just couldn't be too careful. One season, it had been extremely hot and dry, and there had been a fire ban for weeks. I was out planting on my assigned patch of land when another tree planter rushed over to me waving his arms. I usually planted with headphones on, which wasn't the smartest thing to do, I know, but it made the time go faster. I really should have been more alert and listening for wildlife and things. My music was cranked up and I had been focused on my work, which means looking down a lot. My coworker had been sent to get my attention because I hadn't realized what was happening around me. There were 12 people on our crew. We were each assigned our own block of wilderness to work. I was just zoning out in my own area. A fire had sparked up and I hadn't even realized it. I had kind of noticed that it was hazy, but I had dismissed it as fog that hadn't burned off all the way yet. I remember I had also caught a glimpse of clouds I'd thought were rain clouds, but now I realized it was smoke. I realized that day that you don't always see smoke if you're not looking for it. My coworker told me we were getting surrounded by a fire that had sprung up suddenly. I should mention this was a helicopter job, which means that a helicopter picks up your crew in the morning. They fly you in and drop you in the middle of the area being reforested. You're just kind of in the middle of nowhere. You only have whatever you strap to your pack for the day. It turned out that other crews were on other blocks which were about to catch fire too. No one expected it. The fire just started, and the wind was high. Me and the guy who found me met up with our foreman and raced off to find the rest of our crew. Your crew becomes your family, and we would get everyone out or die trying. Our foreman was trying to contact a chopper to get us out as soon as possible. There were only 3 choppers for the whole camp. There were probably about a dozen crews working out there, so almost 150 people to evacuate. There were only about 6 seats available for people on each chopper. It was scary to contemplate. It meant that the project manager and foreman had to decide who got out and when. That meant a lot of trying to get accurate information from scared people in the field who know they may not get out if they aren't prioritized. We just focused on finding the rest of our crew. Like me, most hadn't figured out what was happening. Every planter we'd get, we would split off to find the next planter. It was a lot of ground to cover, and you had to keep your head on straight. It was important to work fast, but getting injured by being in a big hurry would put you and everyone else at a huge risk. We finally managed to get the whole crew grouped together with the foreman. Everyone was all right, except for the threat of the fire, obviously. We got the okay to go to the clearing where the helicopter would land. We were heading that way, and I was at the back of the line. That's when I heard the horrible yelping sound, like an animal in pain. I looked back and couldn't believe my eyes. My first thought was that it was a bear. There was a huge creature lumbering out of the forest, screaming. It sounded almost human. It was covered in reddish-brown hair and incredibly tall. It was way too tall to be a bear. If anything, it looked way more like an ape. I screamed and everybody else looked back. Then everybody was yelling, "Oh my God!" and running like hell toward the helicopter. We all managed to climb into the copter while the creature kept running toward us and screaming at the top of its lungs. We lifted up just when it reached the clearing. I'll never forget looking down into that creature's face as we left the ground. It had these beady black eyes that I swear were looking right at me. I couldn't tell if it was scared or angry. I felt terrible leaving it there. What if it was asking for help? But what could we do, you know? It might have wanted to harm us. And there's no way we could have fitted on that copter. It was like 8 feet tall. It had these huge shoulders and chest, but still I feel guilty to this day. I really hope that it didn't get caught in the fire. All the people on the mountain made it out okay. A few weeks later, we came back to finish planting the blocks that we'd abandoned because of the fire. Parts of the forest had gotten scorched and parts were untouched. It felt strange to be back. I was definitely looking out for signs of that beast. I didn't see anything unusual. When our foreman had made the report, he'd made it sound like we saw something resembling a bear. But we had all seen it, and we knew better. I used to be able to approach a dog like it was nothing you know, no second thought, no fear whatsoever. Now I hesitate or just ignore them completely. It was about 3 years ago when this happened, maybe 3.5 now. Time goes by so fast. I had spent the day with friends playing mud ball. That's just football in the mud and rain. American football, if that helps, since sometimes people think I'm talking about soccer. Anyway, we had played all day, smashing each other into the mud, flying into puddles. It was great fun. It was starting to get dark when we were slowing down. Everyone rehydrated and hung around shooting the breeze. One team lording over the other. You know how it goes with guys in sports. Even friendly competitions are fuel for the fire. We just can't help ourselves at times. I had driven with my friend Jeff, and people were beginning to head out for their respective homes. We stayed a little later than most, but eventually we started to walk back to the car. The parking lot was on the other side of the park, so it was a pretty good walk back. Jeff was tossing the ball to himself as we walked, and we were just rehashing the game and all the fun we had. People sometimes bring their dogs to the park, but most of them do it during the day. The park was pretty empty by now. We were some of the last ones to leave. A light rain started to fall, so we walked under the trees to try and keep it off our heads. We first heard like a low howling and thought someone's dog didn't like the rain and was letting everyone know it. A few minutes later, we saw a dog far off to our left, which I think was West. He was big and black with long pointed ears. He was sitting on top of a hill, still as stone. I thought it was kind of odd, and I told Jeff it looks like he's watching us. We laughed it off and kept walking to the car. We were almost there. I remember my teeth started to chatter a little bit from being soaked. We started to get nervous when we walked through this patch of trees, and the black dog was already on the other side. He'd have to move pretty fast for that to happen, but he was just sitting at attention again, watching us walk towards the parking lot. It was odd, but we really didn't think much of it. I mean, it was just a dog, right? About 10 minutes later, we get to the car, and the dog is there, sitting next to the driver's side door. We both stopped dead. He didn't make a sound, didn't attempt to move out of our way. He just sat at attention by the door. Jeff and I just look at each other. We were acting ridiculous, so we started yelling, telling him to get going, normal stuff. He just sat and stared at us. The weirdest thing was that his eyes seemed to be a bright green. I turned to Jeff and asked if that was right or not. I'm not a dog expert, but it seemed odd to me. He said he knew some dogs could have blue eyes, so he was pretty sure they could probably have green eyes. This dog's eyes, though, they seemed brighter to me. I don't know. Jeff got the brilliant idea to scare him away with the football, and that's when all hell broke loose. He aimed the ball at the front tire and launched it. The dog bared his teeth and lunged forward at us, and we took off. I know you are not supposed to run from an animal chasing you, but we didn't really think about it. We just did it. You could hear him snarling and snapping at us from behind, barking, its teeth snapping together, its paws on the concrete. We just kept going until we couldn't run anymore, and then we pulled ourselves up into a tree. There was no dog behind us. We looked all around us and didn't see a thing. That's when we heard it howling again, snarling around us, around the tree we were in, but we didn't see the thing. It was darker than before, but we should have been able to see it. We didn't see anything around us move unless it was from the light breeze picking up. It seemed to get louder around us. You could hear the nails of the dog on the tree, but we couldn't see him. Then just like that, it went silent. Dead silent. There were no dog sounds, no birds, nothing. We just sat in the tree, looking around, trying to spot something moving around us. How long were we in the tree? I really don't know. It seemed like a long time, maybe 40 minutes, maybe an hour. I guess it could have been much shorter, but it seemed like forever to us. It was Jeff who got brave and jumped down first. I followed him, and at first we just stood by the tree watching and waiting. That's when it came out, rushing out of the brush at us, and we took off again. I yelled to head for the parking lot. My chest was about to explode. I've never run so fast. It hurt to breathe, and I was getting really tired. I hit the button to unlock the car on my key ring and pulled open the driver's side door as fast as I could. I did the same to shut it behind me. Jeff did the same, but that didn't stop the dog. He slammed into the car, barking, snarling, drooling, jumping up and down on the door, on the hood. His nails dug into the paint. Then suddenly he was gone. It was like a blink, and he seemed to disappear. I turned and looked at Jeff, and he looked at me, and I started the car and took off like a bat out of hell. People tell me it was probably a stray with rabies or something. That's why it was so aggressive. I don't know, though. There was something about that night, that dog, something else that I can't explain. I'm gun-shy around dogs now. We've been back to that park a few times. Nothing like that has ever happened again. Maybe it was a dog with rabies, I don't know.